In this video we're going to be replacing the lower control arm here, which includes the ball joint and also two rear bushings in a 2007 SATURN VUE. The procedures in this video, along with the tips, tricks and symptoms of a bad lower control arm, apply to pretty much any vehicle, year, make and model, so follow along and let's get started. So like always, what we do here, before we actually go ahead and replace the part, I just talk about the job of the control arm and symptoms of a worn lower control arm. Now, what is a lower control arm? What does it do? Well, the wheels are connected to the suspension by components called control arms. This is what you see here. They're one of the core components of a suspension and serve as the direct connection between the front wheels and the vehicle's frame. So this is where the wheel connects onto the car. If you look behind here, this is the control arm here. Right here, this is what you see on the floor there, and you can see it's actually bolted into the frame of the vehicle using two bolts here and also a bushing right here. So it pretty much connects the wheel hub to the frame of the car. And what is the job of the lower control arm once it ties into the rest of the suspension and whatnot? Well, it just provides the wheels with synchronization and stabilization as they're rotating on the road. It's especially helpful when you drive over uneven terrain or bumps, as they guide the wheels up and down with the road surface. Now, as far as lower control arms go, they really rarely fail. You know, the control arm itself is solid steel. Unless you go over a rock or a really big boulder, you might dent it and it'll go bad that way. But the common symptoms of failure are these bushings here. You can see they're made of rubber right there, and that goes all the way through here and bolts onto the frame right there with a bolt. And also on the other side, you can see there's a rubber bushing inside there. Coming over the front of the control arm, there's also a boot here which is filled with grease, and when the grease leaks out you might get a rip in the boot. This joint can fail, so as you can see out of the box it's really stiff. I can barely move it, but over time this gets sloppy and it can fail as well. So they're actually the three sort of failure points of this particular lower control arm, and it's always with the weak components, which is the rubber and the boot, for example. So when looking for points of failure in a lower control arm, now you know what they do and how they go wrong. It's pretty easy to spot. This is an older one here. The bushing is quite worn, and what happens is the bolt here starts wiggling in and out of this socket, causing, you know, various metal on metal sounds and various things like that. Also down here, the same thing can happen. And like I said, it's rare the arm itself goes bad. It's just a bit of rust, but that's considered okay. And lastly, with the lower ball joints, which are connected to these lower control arms, again, the grease can leak and this can have so much play in it as well. So now we know the job of a lower control arm, we know some of the symptoms of failure and why it fails. It becomes easier to understand the symptoms, which I'll go through now. So one thing to note is lower control arms can have similar symptoms to other suspension components. You know, as they're all tied together, they can exhibit similar symptoms. But I'll go through some of the things that are more specific to lower control arms so you can sort of pinpoint your exact issue. So a common one is steering wheel pulling. So a bad lower control arm may cause your steering wheel to pull when you're driving, especially when you go over bumps. So you go over a bump and it just pulls to the left or right. So that's a good sign of a bad lower control arm. Another one, steering wheel vibrations. The intensity of the vibrations will increase as you step on the accelerator, and they may smooth out at higher speeds. Another one, clunking noises. Consider the noise as a warning sign, as worse symptoms to come. So that's a sign of that rubber failing in the bushing that we're talking about. You see the clunk, which is kind of like the bolt touching the lower control arm, giving like a kind of like a clunking sound which comes through the car. You may have an erratic steering wheel. Say you're going 50 miles an hour, it might be doing something like this. It might be just wandering and you can't sort of work it out what's going on here. Again, it could be a loose suspension component, but it could be worn lower control arm bushings. So knocking or clunking noises, which may be louder when going over bumps. So you go over a bump and the clunking is slightly louder than normal. Again, this is pointing to your suspension, as when you go over a bump, for example, it puts more load and stress on the suspension, so you would hear it a lot louder. A clicking, popping or snapping sound when the wheel is turned. Eventually, as it gets even more, sort of worse, The clicking and popping can turn into a squeaking sound at the end of a stop when the gas pedal is used or when turning the steering wheel. And lastly, if it's gone undiagnosed for a while, you will start to develop excessive or unusual tire wear. You might have wear marks in one certain spot. This is because it can throw off the alignment specs, such as the camber. So the easiest way to really check to see if you have a problem with the suspension, including the lower control arm, is just a visual inspection. Nothing beats it. The best way to do this is put the front end of the vehicle on jack stands. So just apply the parking brake, front end on jack stands so the suspension is unloaded. It's just off the floor on both sides. And then just grab the wheel at 9 to 3 and 12 to 6 and just move it around. Try and find play. It could just be a bolt which is undone, maybe like a wheel bearing bolt or something like that. It could be a number of things because the symptoms are very similar across the whole suspension. So just check for play, and while you're checking for play, go under the car or have someone move the wheel while you're under the car and check. Have someone in the vehicle and turn the steering wheel left to right. Just check for play all over the suspension, and again, you will find it unless it's so minute, but I'm figuring you're watching the video because something's gone wrong, and almost guaranteed you will find it. So that's the number one tip in order to check for play in any of the suspension components. So if you're almost sure the lower control arm is your problem, it's good to do a last check. Just put the body of the car on jack stands, you see here, so the suspension is sagging, it doesn't have a load on it. We're just going to put a jack underneath the joint here, and that is this bushing joint right here, and we can check for play by just raising the jack. We can look for play in this joint right here, similarly on the other side with the other bushing here. And again, coming down here, this is the lower ball joint. We can check for grease leakage, rips in the boots, and various things like that. So it is really easy to check these symptoms and signs of a worn bushing and whatnot while it's still on the vehicle. So now we've talked about all the symptoms and what it actually does, let's talk about the replacement part. Now you might be following along just because you want to replace this lower ball joint here. Now the OEM lower control arm for this particular vehicle, your application may be different. The lower ball joint here is actually riveted onto the lower control arm. So if you only want to replace this component, you have to drill out all the rivets, find some replacement bolts and bolt in a new one. That takes a lot of time and a lot of work. If you do want to do that, I'll link a video in the description below where I did exactly that to this particular car. You can follow along that, replace your lower ball joint, you're good to go. However, if you buy the whole thing here, then the cost of this bushing here and this lower ball joint is around the same as buying this whole thing together. And again, there is a time factor and also an effort factor as well as tools as well. If you want to only replace this bushing here, you can do that. It's around $10–15. However, you need a bearing press to actually press this out. You can't just pull it out with some pliers or something like that. You need some special tools. And again, the same applies for the other side as well. You need a special press just to press these out. So if you factor those things in, the tools, the time and everything else, drilling out these rivets, it's more cost efficient just to get the whole thing and replace it all at once. Chances are if you have a gash in here and the joint's kind of going, these bushings aren't far behind either, especially if your car has 150,000 miles, just a ballpark figure. Like these things do go. Anything made of rubber does crack and deteriorate, so it's good just to replace the whole thing. It's more cost efficient and just do it all at once, which is what we're doing in this video. So here are some of the tools you need to complete this job. Obviously you need the replacement part here. You may need a grease gun if you need to fill it up with grease. We'll talk about that soon. Bag of sockets. Open-ended wrenches are pretty important in this job because some of the bolts and nuts and things we can't get a socket into. There's not enough room, so these are very important for this job. A leverage tool, a hammer, obviously, and a jack and jack stands. And I do recommend some anti-seize here, which is pretty important when tightening suspension components like bolts and things, because we don't want them to come undone. So let's get started. And for all the tools, parts and everything, I'll link them in the description below, so check those out. So let's get started. Apply the parking brake in the vehicle, jack the vehicle up, place it on jack stands on the body of the car so the suspension is sagging, and then we'll resume from there. I've already done the passenger side, so I'm going to go in with the driver's side. Depending if you're replacing one or two, it really doesn't matter. It's just extra practice. So coming under here, the lower ball joint here is actually attached to the steering knuckle there with a cotter pin and a castle nut, which is in the center of the shot right here. We're going to use some pliers to maneuver this cotter pin out, and then we're going to undo this castle nut here, which is an 18mm. Because I have the suspension sagging in the air, you know, it's on jack stands on both sides, I can just grab this with my hands and maneuver it left to right to get access in this side or that side. So do remember that when doing this job. So the cotter pin has been removed from the castle nut, which holds on the lower ball joint. It is recommended you replace these, it states it in the service manual. However, some people reuse them. So the castle nut there is 18mm. You'll need an open end wrench in order to get that off, because there's not enough room for a socket. For anything you can't get a torque wrench on and you're reusing the bolts and whatnot, just mark it with a marker pen. Then as long as it's lined up when you're tightening, then you know you have the correct torque. So a little tip there. So with the castle nut loose there, just leave it at the top of the threads there, because we don't want to damage the threads when we try and pry out the lower control arm from the steering knuckle right here. So what we're going to do is slot a sort of like a crowbar or a prying tool between the top of the castle nut and the CV axle here, and just pry downwards, and that should pop the lower ball joint here out of the steering knuckle. It's usually seized in there. So I have a little crowbar here, a little prying tool. I've inserted it in that gap and I'm just going to pull down on it, and that should separate the two. So once it's separated from the knuckle there, we can remove the castle nut and just set it to one side. So the next one I'm going for is this front bushing bolt right here. You can see I've got an open end on that end and a socket on the rear end there. On the front end it's 21mm nut, and on the rear it's an 18mm bolt. We're going to need something on each end in order to undo it, and it's on there pretty good. So for this one, I just recommend putting the socket there on the right hand side up through the hole in the middle there. You can see it's right there, and just leaving it there. The frame of the car will actually keep that in place and put on the pressure for us. And then on the front end, I've just got an open-ended wrench there. Box end is fine too. You can't really get a socket on because there's not much room right there. It's very tight. Then just put a long sleeve on it and you get all the leverage you need in order to whack that nut loose. So the bolt's almost out now. Don't worry if you can't pull it out, it'll just, you know, fall out when we get the last few bolts out. So that's pretty much the front one done there. On the rear here, there's only two more we're going for, which are these two nuts. They're both 18mm, and there's a bolt which goes through, and that's 15 on the bottom, and you'll have to keep the 15 steady while you undo both 18s here. The one on the side we're not going to touch at all, there's no need to. And with those two removes, the lower control arm will pretty much just drop out the vehicle. So just wiggle it and the bolts will slowly drop down. And again for the front one here. Just a little tip, if you want the lower control arm, the lower ball joint bolt here, which the castle nut was on to clear the knuckle here, just put your foot on there, press down, and that way we can just swing it out of the way. So the old one's out. We're going to prepare the new one to install that into the car. First thing we're going to do is remove the castle nut and remove this shipping sort of protection. It's not needed. Next, we're going to check if this has a Zerk fitting. Now what a Zerk fitting is, it's just a fancy way to let grease get into the joint here so that it doesn't dry out and, you know, seize and snap, and then we'll need a new one later. So underneath, this is what a Zerk fitting looks like, just like that. Now for your part, you should read the instructions. It might be pre-greased from the factory, in which the grease is already in here, and this is just convenience for a later date, so you can add grease later on, you know, in a couple years time or whatnot. However, it might not have grease in it, in which you will need to provide your own, so something like a grease gun is quite important here. So how that works, you just push the grease gun end onto the Zerk fitting, like that, it just snaps into place, and then we can just pump it full of grease. And when you pump things full of grease, you want to make sure you don't overfill them, so it shouldn't be bulging or anything like that. It shouldn't be leaking grease out the top, but also it shouldn't be totally empty. So
not bulgy but not empty. So a good rule of thumb is if you fill it somewhat and just give it a tiny squeeze, you might see a bit leak out the sides here, and that should be enough for your lower ball joint. If you look at the old one here, you can see the boot is quite, it's quite squashed down and it's compromised, so there's a little bit of gap here for debris to get in, and when debris gets into a joint like this, it only does more damage from there. So it's a pretty good opportunity and reason that we're replacing this now. So I've added the grease into the Zerk fitting there at the bottom. Don't worry if you don't have a Zerk fitting or you can't add your own grease. It just means it's a sealed system. There will be grease in there from the factory, don't worry about that. So with the grease here, it's not bulging so that there's so much in there and it might split under its own capacity of grease, but there is some in there, and when you push this down you can sort of see the grease in there. So that's sort of how you know. Again, you can service this when it's on the vehicle, so don't worry about getting it perfect now, but this is a good rule of thumb. I think this will be fine, to be honest. The next thing we're going to do is loosen this 21mm bolt here, because we want this to run independently of the control arm when we put it in the vehicle. We can't put it in like this, there's slightly not enough clearance by this much. You'll see what I mean in a second. So we just want to crack this so this bit spins free. So the best way of doing that is to put your foot on here, just get a wrench on and push down, get a hammer, whatever works. We only want to crack it just so that it does this. It just spins independently of the arm. It just helps with installation. If yours is already loose like that, fine, that's great. So let's get installing this. For those of you that are curious about this bushing, it pretty much just slides on here and it's secured with the nut there. And this is what it kind of looks like on each side there. Just for those of you that are curious. So if you don't crack that end 21mm bolt, this is what you'll sort of have here. You'll try and install it, and this end just will not go in this bracket. Because we've cracked it, it allows us to turn this independently, and then we can actually put it into the socket where it belongs without any problems. So it's just a clearance thing. So we're just going to push this where it needs to go. Next, we're going to feed in all the bolts where they're supposed to go. So these go upwards like this with the nuts on top. Again, that one right here as well. And we're going to pop the lower ball joint into the steering knuckle down there. So we don't want to crank them down now, we just want to set them all in. So with all these nuts and bolts here, I highly recommend using some removable Loctite here. That just prevents anything that normally vibrates, especially suspension components. The bolts don't come undone naturally through going over bumps and rough terrain and things like that. So I recommend putting just a bit of that on all the threads for all these suspension components. So these two, that one, and also the lower ball joint castle nut there as well. So that is all you need, not much at all. So a tip for getting the lower ball joint there into the knuckle, just use a car jack and just use it as a guide. You don't really want to go crazy and damage anything, but just to take the weight off and guide it into the knuckle there. So now everything's slug, we haven't torqued anything down yet, everything's in place, it's settled in. We're going to torque this castle nut down to 30 foot-pounds. Again, if you put a marker on there, you know exactly where it lines up. And then we're going to insert a cotter pin so it doesn't undo while we're driving. So next, the top two right here, these are 52 foot-pounds. The next one, the front bushing nut there, that's 85 foot-pounds. So now everything's torqued down, all three there. I recommend jacking up the control arm and just checking your torque settings just in case. You don't want a false torque reading if there wasn't any load on the suspension. So little tip there. And the last but not least, the bolt on the back here, which we actually cracked earlier, we have to tighten this one down to 148 foot-pounds. So pretty much like an axle nut, almost as hard as you can go. So that one there, and I believe it's a 21mm. And with that side nut down there, we are good to go. And that is how to replace a lower control arm on a SATURN VUE 2007, but the principles apply on pretty much any vehicle that has control arms, which is quite a lot of them. So I hope that you found this video useful. Like and subscribe, I hope it helped you. All the parts and everything in the description below. Check it out. Thank you for watching.